Welcome, everyone, to Academy Securities' latest geopolitical webinar. Today, we'll be discussing the risks of nuclear proliferation with a focus on the nuclear negotiations with Iran and the recent hypersonic missile tests by China. Today, I'm joined by Academy's Geopolitical Advisory Board members, General Frank Kearney and General Spider Marks. General Kearney served as the House Armed Services Committee National Defense Panel, Secretary of Defense's WMD Threat Reduction Advisory Committee, and on the Iran project. General Spider Marks, our head of geopolitical strategy, served as the lead intelligence officer on the Korean Peninsula. Recent issues around nuclear proliferation may not move markets dramatically, but our head of macro strategy, Peter Chur, will help contextualize the insights from General Marks and General Kearney in order to better help you understand this complex and sometimes daunting topic. As always, we are grateful that you've taken time out of your busy day to spend with us. If you have any questions during this discussion, please type them into the Q&A portion on your screen. You can also reach out to us at any time at info@academysecurities.com. To start off this conversation, let's go ahead and set a baseline about where we are currently with the Iran nuclear negotiations. The last administrations pulled us out of the JCPOA, and the current administration is trying to reestablish a new negotiation framework. General Spider Marks, would love to have you start out and discuss the current state of those negotiations.
Well, I would think, well, first of all, Rachel and everybody, thank you so much for joining this podcast today. Again, Academy Securities wouldn't be in a place where we are today, being able to help veterans transition without your support. So thank you very, very much for that. Look, this administration stated up front that they were looking to try to expand and broaden the terms of the JCPOA, of the Iran nuclear deal, in order to offer a way for the United States and establish a way for the United States to get back on board. I think that's now been, that door has kind of closed as a result of some of the efforts that have been made by the Iranians to increase their enriched uranium and the level to which that uranium has been enriched. Look, the primary problem that we have with where we were with the previous deal and where we are today is a thing called breakout. How much time would it take for the Iranians to have, how long would it take for them to create a nuclearized weapon? They've got the enrichment program ongoing. How long would it take for them to now weaponize all that, stick it on a missile, and be able to transport it or at least send it someplace else? What Iran has achieved over the course of this administration, and clearly at the end of the previous administration, is an increase in the production of their uranium, to include in locations that have not been declared to the IAEA. And that's really kind of at the heart of the problem. What that means is that they're now in a position to have leverage over any type of a deal that the United States tries to strike. It changes the dynamic and the variables in terms of what that might look like going forward. So I would say, at least in my view, the executive summary is the United States wants to create a JCPOA-like arrangement, not to simply get back into the JCPOA as it was. So it's up to the United States to establish good intelligence collection, partners in the arena, in other words, to have diplomatic solutions around which we can now monitor this thing with other partners. Sanctions very much need to be a part of it. The Iranians always put on the table, before we talk about anything, you got to drop the sanctions. That's cart in front of the horse. But if you could do intel, you could do diplomacy, and then you can come up with what a JCPOA 2 might look like. Now we're in a position where we can move forward. We always then reserve the right of the fourth option, which is military actions, some type of covert or overt operations, which would include, obviously, and let's be frank, the Israelis, if we were going to move down that path.
General Kearney, I guess on the lines of how nations are always going to act in their best self-interest, why is it so important from a U.S. perspective that we keep Iran from developing a nuclear weapon? And maybe you can talk a little bit about from how they see it from their seat in the Middle East.
Well, when you think about Iran, you got to think about much like China, a nation who has a great history, was a world power, and as a result, they feel over the years they have been treated poorly by the international community. And in particular, since the coup and the takeover in 1979, the Iranians and the North Koreans, most people who seek nuclear weapons really seek power. Okay, it's not the use of a weapon system that is in their best interest. It brings them to the bargaining table. It means we have to have conversations with them. So from their standpoint, moving the ball down the road means that we have to have a conversation. They also believe that they have an inherent right to develop nuclear power, use nuclear power in their own self-interest. And of course, the Ayatollah previously had put out a fatwa that said they would not ever develop a nuclear weapon. That was the standing policy. They've had a huge change in political leadership to hardliners at this particular point in time, which makes the negotiations even a little bit more difficult as they look inward to how they're treated, how they do things. Another big point is Iranian nationalism. I think we were moving along a path where they had a giant youth bulge that wanted to re-enter the world, that was listening, that was connected through all types of internet platforms and things like that, and growing. So knowledge about the outside world competes with the Islamic narrative of the Islamic Republic of Iran. So part of this is just a giant power play. The second piece is nationalism, to keep their own people, leaning towards their own government. You've got to have a great Satan like the United States and the West to be able to focus things. And if you recall the discussions about the Iranian guards, the IRGC, the Revolutionary Guards Corps, they have one purpose. Their purpose is to sustain the revolution. And they are embedded in most of the Iranian businesses now. The retired IRGC folks are doing all that. They really run the military, even though there are separate branches of the military that are not IRGC related. The leadership comes with it. And they also are completely involved in developing who the political candidates will be that run. They're part of the councils that make those decisions. So when you look at the power dynamics in Iran, having an argument to your own people that you have the right to have nuclear power, the right to have nuclear weapons, and the enemies in the West are trying to suppress us and keep us down and sanction us, you have really the justification and the baseline for how they see the world, how they respond to us. And I would add to some of Spider's remarks, recently they have begun to enrich uranium to 60%. And I think many people understand that, nuclear grade weapons uranium is about 90% or higher. So we've reduced what the original JICPOA's goal was, to have a 1-year runway. Okay, so that we had that much time to take diplomatic, military, economic actions through different measures to be able to retard the path that they were on. That right now, by some experts at 60%, is compressed to 2 months potentially, where you can move forward. They've also recently, again, and this is not the first time, but they've made metallic uranium. So the next phase of taking, the products of the centrifuges and the rods, and then making the beginnings of the metal that would be shaped into in the right, weights to be able to create a reaction is again occurring. And all these are very overt. They're not hiding it, although we don't have people inside collecting specific data. But these are all things on the bargaining table. This is where they will go, as opposed to limiting their ability to influence and do malign behavior in the Middle East and around the world. So what they're doing is they're elevating the stakes so that we will take them down through a nuclear negotiation, rather than the other things with missile technology and their activities to influence the Middle East. So I'll quiet down for a minute and let somebody else jump in.
Well, no, what Frank just indicated is that there also is an obligation on the part of the IAEA, the governing body and the inspectors, in order to provide the insights to do exactly what Frank described. And I don't know that it'd be fair to call the IAEA a feckless organization, but in order for the United States, which really has a large dog in this fight here, to feel confident that the information is flowing forward, we have to be that much more embedded in terms of what those inspections look like. And that's a non-starter from the Iranians. So the breakout, or the runway period, as Frank described, has been so incredibly truncated. We're at the point now where it could be one of those no notice type of events where suddenly Iran declares through testing that they've got a nuclear capability. And we could be totally surprised by that.
A lot of the nuclear capable nations out there don't test. Like the Israelis have never tested, though we all know they have the capability, because if you test, you are now declared, and it adds to the proliferation piece. And so the Israelis have never declared, because quite honestly, we talk about a nuclear proliferation race in the Middle East. There has been one going on for some time between the Israelis and different Middle Eastern partners out there. Yet we have been able, through negotiations, to keep our Arab allies, the GCC countries, who use nuclear power for water purification and things, because it takes so much energy to do so, from moving forward with nuclear development, and really the same kind of missile development that the Iranians have had to reach out and touch the United States and all of our shipping.
You both touched on a couple of things that I find really interesting and that I wanted to build on. First, with Israel not formally declaring or acknowledging their nuclear capability, is that in a sense to avoid some element of scrutiny and international legal obligation on how to manage their program?
No, in my view, the Israelis have never acknowledged it. It is a known fact. I mean, it's almost declared if you were to look at it. But there is an obligation to open yourself up to or at least not necessarily to be a signatory to the Non-Proliferation Treaty, but which is embedded in the IAEA's work and the United Nations, both the Security Council and the General Council. Israel doesn't necessarily get in line with that directly. Our relationship with Israel puts us in a position of a level of confidence that they are in fact walking the path that allows them, with a level of confidence, to have this capability, and they certainly reserve the right to have it. That becomes the sticking point in terms of our presence, our influence in the Middle East. Iran would say immediately, well, in fact, the latest, the new, I can't remember his name in Israel, Bennett, the new leader in Bennett has indicated, look, we will not stand for Iran to have a nuclear weapon. Iran's immediate response to that is, how can you tell us not to have a nuclear weapon when you do? And clearly Iran only has, in their mind, peaceful ambitions for their nuclear weapons. Clearly that's a subterfuge, and we know that that's a challenge. But that type of a relationship Frank has already described, which is really at the crux of the issue here. Israel has them, the world knows they have them, but they haven't declared it. How they walk the line is through relations with us, where we know that their mechanisms for control over that weapon system, those capabilities, match ours.
Speaking to the nation's self-interest, obviously in this scenario, Israel does get a vote. The recent advancements being reported out of Iran. What are we concerned about as far as how Israel will address these advancements? They've been involved in some sort of kinetic sabotage in the past. Do we anticipate something like that happening again, given the recent reports? And how does the U.S. manage that dynamic?
Israel has a lot of different capabilities and has demonstrated them in the past. They have been more than willing to eliminate knowledge through the human that's carrying that knowledge. Okay, so they are not afraid at all to take out technology experts in the nuclear field. A lot of them now, of course, are not separated into a military organization. They teach at Tehran University. They have all those things in there. So that gives the Iranians the opportunity to say, hey, you're coming in here and killing civilian professors rather than military scientists. Again, a lot of this is about world opinion and how we see things. They have cyber capabilities, which they have demonstrated can be used and have allegedly done so in the past, as well as the allegations against the United States in cooperation with them. The Israelis have limited capability to destroy or eliminate the ability of the Iranians to do things. So if you take the real strong point of Fordow, which is under geographic formations dug in there. Israeli weapon systems, and they have the F-35 now, and it's a stealth capability, but it can carry up to about 18,000 pounds of ordnance, but that's with a lot of it hanging outside, which makes it less stealthy. But the largest bomb they carry is a 5,000-pound bomb, and maybe they could carry 2 on the wings, but they'd probably be detected on the way in if they did that. That will not destroy the shelter and the geographic formations around Fort Howe. The United States has built a 25,000-pound massive ordnance penetrator to be able to do that. And we have 2 platforms that can carry that bomb and deliver it, one stealth and one not. And so when you take a look at what it would take for the Israelis to do this, they would have to take off heavy. They'd have to have a lot of their aircraft carrying things. You'd have to do repeated strikes, and they would get one shot at it, because once the air defense systems come on, we are now in a different situation where they can't re-engage the target after a battle damage assessment. And if they did it without U.S. coordination and support, then we would all be in a terrible situation. And you would have to expect that the Iranians will respond. And to an unprovoked attack on a peaceful nuclear, capability that we're developing for energy purposes, you'll get an argument in there, and it'll go to the UN, and there'll be all kinds of issues, and likely, the 4 global players that will fight against anything in the United States will align behind them. I mean, the Chinese, the Russians, the North Koreans will be with the Iranians in viewing that as a hostile act, and we'll go forward. But again, it won't do things. Now they can hit surface and low kind of places, but when you look at where they are, they're all very deep in Iran. They're all in and around the Tehran, Esfahan area, and Esfahan is one of the most culturally diverse areas in Iran historically. And I know when I was part of the Iran project and we were briefing Iranian citizens in the United States, they were aghast that we would even consider doing that and releasing hexafluorine gas into the atmosphere, which would have a devastating effect. The other thing, when you look at Israel, I mean, the Iranians are unlikely to use a nuclear weapon against Israel. Who surrounds Israel? All Arab nations. There is going to be fallout, especially if it's a ground penetrating burst. You're going to have a great deal of that. If it's an air burst, you're still going to have radiation that moves, and it'll move on the wind of that particular day. Hopefully they've done their homework on weather patterns and know where it's going to go. Similarly, I don't think the Israelis would use a nuclear weapon, because just becoming the second nation to use a nuclear weapon to destroy nuclear facilities will be in a different place in the world. And I think it's a declaration politically by the Israelis to gain global support, for their position. But I think in both cases, it's unrealistic that they could attack and be as successful as they had, like taking out a Syrian plant when it was being built. You can get away with that kind of stuff, but that a release will kill people, a lot of people. Over.
What Frank described is really an Israeli desire to eliminate, but really a capability to disrupt the development of Iranian nuclear capabilities. The counterbalance to that is, if the Iranians were to achieve that capability, then clearly the Saudis would have that capability. And then we have a condition that Frank just described so very well, that is untenable. And the results of that kind of a posturing, not even with an exchange, are almost unacceptable. I would imagine around the kitchen table in a whole bunch of towns and cities in Iran, if their young son comes to the table and says, "Hey, Mom, hey, Dad, I really want to grow up and be a nuclear physicist," I would bet Mom and Dad would go, hey, let's have a conversation about another industry vertical you can get into. I mean, you put yourself, as Frank described, you put yourself at great risk. You start walking around with that type of capability under your arm, you've got crosshairs on you.
The other side of this is, should there be an error and something occur, this is when, historically, Iranian action in the Middle East has affected oil prices, anything in the Straits, anything that would reduce the flow of tankers doing things. We have a more robust capability globally to react to that now, But if you look at the threat of nuclear war occurring if Israel attacks, Iran, and then there's some response, I think it would have a global economic impact, at least for a period of time in there. And I know that's the kind of stuff that China doesn't want to see. That everybody, China really would like the economic system to work really well while they behind the scenes develop their capabilities to do the things they need to do.
Yeah, they would benefit from this.
Yeah, and that's a perfect segue into my next question before we get Peter's take. Gentlemen, just want to hear the previous strategy, last 18 months of, well, really 36 months of applying pressure on Iran around these negotiations had a very international coalition and drive. Get our partners to help put the same economic pressure on Iran. Hopefully this will influence the outcome of the negotiations. Obviously, as you already mentioned, there are other nations and other parties providing some economic relief on the backside of our organized effort. Today, what is that international coalition to confront Iran's nuclear ambitions look like? Has it been effective? Is it currently effective? We'd just love to hear your thoughts on the current state of that.
Just real quickly up front, and then I'll defer to Frank, is the European signatories to the JICPOA were shocked and clearly concerned with what Frank described, which is the declaration, or at least the understanding now, that Iran has enriched uranium to 60%, which was unheard of previously, and that there haven't been these linear, very precise steps. There's been a leap function in terms of Iran capabilities. So it's really tossed what might have been in 2015 when the JICPOA was signed, a sense of optimism that there could be some controls as we go down the path, which would have been eventually by 2025 or 2030, a breakout in terms of a whole host of nuke capabilities within Iran. I think there's been a shattering of that confidence that we now have a controlled mechanism. So I think it changes the dynamic. I think the increase in terms of partnerships, it's an opportunity for the United States to increase partnerships and to strengthen sanctions against the Iranians where they stand right now, not to embrace them based on this leap function that they've achieved.
A different and a more bleak view of that is, I look at this economically as well and go, the European nations, the Russians, the Chinese, they all want to trade with Iran. There are a lot of contracts that were in place that are now all threatened or passé based on the fact that the United States unilaterally pulled out of the JICPOA without really consulting with our partners. There's no rolling things back. I mean, I think we have we have to really kind of be realists when we look at this and go, hey, you can't kill knowledge. You can't kill how far they've moved in technological development of the military capability to do things. They will be able to get there at some point in time. What is an acceptable, level of Iranian capability that the Europeans, the Russians, the Chinese will all accept, and how will the U.S. fit into it? There is no trust. Okay, there was none before the JICPOA. We had a few years of good success. We've broken what little trust there was, and I firmly believe that without a U.S. Initial step that says we will roll back if you re-sign, or we roll back something, that they will not come to the table until they're much further along. There's this global brinksmanship. They've watched the Chinese do it with what they're doing with their capabilities, the things they're doing inside of the Pacific area that's contested, overflights of Taiwan, interdicting missile technology, and they've watched the Russians do it in the Ukraine and in other areas where if you take the U.S. to the brink, we can't react fast enough with our national security decision-making system to take actions to do things. And then they go, well, do you want to bomb it? Okay, and the answer really will be, we don't really want to have a nuclear gas release over Iran, either done by the United States or the Israelis unilaterally without some sort of global support for that military action. So I think you're going to see it go to the brink, And then I think you'll see, all right, how are the key players going to act? Who's going to give way first? Because saving face is huge, and not having a national embarrassment by the current administration and the religious leadership in Iran with its people is extraordinarily important to maintaining their support in a world where if they were interacting with it, they would probably have a better life.
And I want to ask Peter, General Marks kind of joked about the bad rep that nuclear gets specific to Iran, but that transcends the geopolitical nature of this conversation. And as General Kearney mentioned earlier when we were chatting, nuclear proliferation, no matter how benign, whether it's for energy or desalinization, that's the first stage of nuclear proliferation. So, Peter, why should our clients and partners care about this conversation? How does this overlap with the emerging ESG space? And would love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, I think, the first part of this conversation has been, great. I think the one positive takeaway is, both generals really talked about nuclear proliferation, much more about showing power rather than actual use. So I think there's a degree of comfort we can all take in that risk of, some sort of nuclear event is highly unlikely. Having said that, I think one thing General Kearney just mentioned, I think is a real issue, and we've been talking about for a while, is almost this three-pronged approach that we are facing, where Russia, China, and Iran all acting, maybe not in concert, but at the same time, each with their own agenda, is a very difficult situation for us. And I think when we look at what's going on with Taiwan, there was just, the meeting or summit, I guess they called it via Zoom or whatever they were using with Xi and Biden, and Taiwan came up a lot. And, I am concerned that I think we underestimate the timeline that we could see friction in Taiwan, not just because of what China's doing, but our eye is taken off the ball in many places. We're looking at a lot of these things. And when I come back to nuclear, though, I find that a lot of it very interesting right now. You've seen the price of uranium double, and Europe is starting, I think, to move towards reinvigorating their nuclear industry. I think France just announced 6 new plants to be built. There's talk that they would need as many as 14 new plants to meet their ESG goals or sustainability goals. You've got the power crisis there. So I think you're going to see more and more people turning to nuclear energy. And I think even in the US, and again, it's been one of our long running themes, is the goal of sustainability is great. A lot of it's been done with very little planning at this stage. And I think you're seeing the worst of it in Europe, where they didn't have enough, of interim, capabilities. Even domestically, I think you're seeing some of that, right? We had massive underinvestment in fossil fuels for the last 5 years, and it's not, you can just snap your fingers and turn the spigot back on. It's more complicated than that. So I think people could turn to nuclear a little bit more. The US, has not had nuclear in any way, shape, or form, except maybe, in the Navy. Where do you see that going? Do you see nuclear power becoming more, topical again? And what implications does that have for nuclear proliferation?
Well, you can only hope that the United States will get on board. It's the fastest way to reduce dependency on fossil fuels, clearly for electricity. And if we're going to go to electrification of automobiles, there's still coal, oil, and fossil fuels powering electric plants in the United States, even though we have hydroelectric, we have a wind, we have a lot of different things, but a lot of it's still right there. And so nuclear power presents the history of success with nuclear capability in the United States Navy is one that the United States ought to be proud of. The leaders in Congress ought to look at that and say, what are we afraid of? Even as we talked earlier, the 3 Mile Island, stuff was really minimal in comparison to what could have happened, because the safeguards were there, and we thought we were very thoughtful about how to do those things. We need to, my personal belief is we need to move there. It also, oddly, on a military side, if you want to use laser, what are largely called rail guns now from naval vessels that are nuclear powered, to use lasers to interdict things, we need a little bit more power in a lot of places to be able to do that with the amount of ubiquity that we will need to be able to intercept hypersonics, to intercept a volley of things in some sort of missile exchange, whether it's nuclear or whether it's conventional warheads on there. So we we don't have enough of any of the things we really need right now. And by putting them on naval vessels, we have given them power, but we've given them mobility so that we could mass them based on a crisis occurring and us sensing it in enough time to be able to mass the resources that we do have in places to do things. Even when we talked about putting in interceptors in Europe to intercept the Iranian missile capability, if should they develop it, you know, we had to negotiate with the Russians and other people about, all right, this changes the, you know, the equation with us. If you put more of them in here, yet you purport that they're for, you know, an Iranian intercept or something like that. I mean, it's a very complex set of negotiations that go on out there, but clearly we don't have enough, especially as we move into the hypersonic era.
Yeah, when you talk about clean energy production, you're talking nuke as nuke power generation. And we just don't hear that discussion at all. It doesn't come up. It's not part of the narrative. And I can't understand why it's not.
Some of it's, what do you do with the you know, the nuclear, the rods that you don't do, the nuclear waste, those kind of things. And, you know, I think the United States has that discussion. I think it was Yucca Mountain or whatever, where they were talking about doing those things. You
Right.
just have to take a look at where technology can take us for disposal properly, safety wise, that we don't do more harm to the environment with nuclear byproducts than we do with fossil fuels. It's hard to see that now. But I mean, what are the nations who use it a lot doing? I mean, what's the French plan? We can learn a lot from others. We just sometimes have some hubris and arrogance here in the United States. And we look back in history about small things that prevent us from moving forward and doing something which makes perfect sense.
And the discussion of this clearly takes you out to the end, the desired end state, and then you work yourself back from that. Well, the end state is when all these rods are used, it starts with, what are we going to do with this stuff when we're done with it? Okay, let's have a full discussion on that, because all of these steps are doable, they're clear, they're understandable, and they're attainable. And I've never really understood why we haven't put nuke straight up on the top of the list of discussion topics for alternatives.
Do you, either of you, know what the Navy does with theirs for their fleet? How they manage that?
I don't know how they deactivate the power plants. I mean, they basically shut down the capability for the reactor to do things, but I don't know what they do with the other components of these systems. Worthy of exploration, but they obviously do something. And it's obviously not publicly available, or we would be reading about it or knowing about it, or it would be, you know, some ecological group would already be on that thing, really tearing it apart. So, you know, I'm not sure, and I think that's worthy of exploration.
Yeah. Well, General Kern, you mentioned hypersonic missiles. Certainly no geopolitical discussion from our team would be complete without addressing the latest tension with China. We've actually seen a ratcheting up around the globe of military posturing. Some of our adversaries, some of our partners, potential partners, displaying their munitions and military capabilities more publicly, including China. They've tested some new technology that we weren't aware that they had. That was kind of, as General Milley described, a Sputnik moment for us. General Marks, would love to hear your thoughts on this new information with regard to Chinese military capability.
Well, the first thing we heard when the Chinese declared, or at least we figured out, that they were doing some hypersonic testing, and the Russians have done that as well. The Russians now have fielded two capabilities, the Avant-Garde and the Zircon, which are 5 times the speed of sound, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And the Chinese have done that, so they're at a lower stage. The first thing you heard from the United States is, we need $4 billion additional money that we haven't asked for, so that we can do some advanced testing, both offensively and some of that to be put toward defensive capabilities. And Frank's already talked about what some of those might look like in terms of how do you get after hypersonics. The problem with hypersonics vis-a-vis our cruise missile experience is cruise missiles can take a pattern, but they generally are a pattern that can become pretty predictable. Hypersonics have a capability of being very low, excessively fast, and can be very random, which makes it very difficult to intercept. So the defensive side of that we can crack that nut. That's not a challenge. We simply have to get about the business of doing it. The concern that I have is that we're now being very responsive to other nations' initiatives, which tends to be what we do historically. Look, our national geostrategic strategy for 40 plus years was a thing called containment, totally defensive in nature. It worked. So we created that muscle memory, but now we, over the course of the last 40 years, have not been able to really effectively break out of that in a way that really gives us a sense of trying to set the tone of what the engagement might look like. And I'm not suggesting it's just kinetic in nature, but clearly the Russians and the Chinese need to improve their military capabilities. Ergo, it becomes responsive to us in terms of what we want to do as they increase.
There's a lot that has to be done. We are behind, and I think that's where the nexus of the Sputnik moment is they're doing things. But hypersonics are not new. Okay, all our ICBMs all are hypersonic on reentry. Okay, but they are very predictable, as Spider said, in the nature. They're a parabolic, flight path. Once it goes up, hits boost phase, goes into the atmosphere, we have enough satellites to be able to track through the radar systems that are out there watching these in enough places. We can see when it reaches apogee where it will come down and the path that it will take. Some of the reentry vehicles have limited ability to steer, but the big thing about hypersonics is they only go up about 19 miles for a hypersonic, glide type vehicle. They don't go to that high arc. They come up, they come down, and a lot of them have, boost engine capability on them to be able to steer shape. And I suspect as our competitors, are more and more in space, they know the pattern of our radar. They know where the gaps are, just like when we're terrain flying. And so they're able to then do that. And we're not able to see until you get reentry where it is that's coming, and then it's moving. As Spider said, 5 times is the definition, but there's some that are going 9 to 12 times the speed of sound up there. So they are moving at lightning speed with different payloads. And they have the ability to circle the globe multiple times if they need to be able to do whatever they want. So it's not just going up and you got gravity taking over, penetrating the atmosphere and coming back down. The constellation of satellites that we would need to have full coverage is something that is almost cost prohibitive. So, the other thing, just like we did with, the Soviet Union, the Reagan administration really went after, a cost burden to them. We are in a cost burden as we decide all the things we want to spend, the US taxpayers' money on here. And the Chinese and the Russians are very, very smart by inventing and innovating in things that would cause us to have to spend more money. And the competition in space just continues to grow and will continue to grow as we move forward. And I think, Rachel, you talked about other nations with their missile technology. Everybody wants to be in space. NASA's Artemis program, where they plan to ultimately go to Mars, they plan to have an orbiter around the moon to be able to resupply a ground station on the moon in order to launch from the southern pole of the moon and reduce the time and distance to get to Mars to do things. So you're looking at the colonization of space, which will lead to the weaponization of interplanetary vehicles, rotating vehicles, even more so than we have today. So imagine an energy capability on the moon that, would be able to interdict things in space. So this is Star Wars kind of things, but from a science point of view, some of these things are feasible. The question is at what cost and at what timeline?
When you look at the interim national security strategy, clearly there's discussion about need for increased focus on cyber, commitment to cyber, IT.
Spider froze up there.
Yeah, I'll just add then while we're waiting for Spider to come back. I think when you think about this from both an investor and a corporate sort of, there are going to be opportunities coming from this competition in hypersonic. And, it seems like all roads lead to space now as well. We've held a couple of webinars about space. It comes up more and more frequently. And, the big hype is obviously the people flying into space, and now that, you've got, personal companies effectively doing that. But I think the real growth is going to be still, how do we compete for space? How do we work in space? How do we take advantage of space? How do we commercialize space? And it sounds like some of these things that with the hypersonic capabilities, it's going to force us in a direction that causes investment, and it's going to create opportunities for either new companies or existing companies to build out in those fields. Because we're always watching, whether it's the defense industry or other industries, right? Where's the future going to be? What are people, what technologies, what companies do you want to own today or invest in today to move forward? And it seems like this is a radically enough change in what's going on that it's striking them, for better or for worse, the right amount of fear to, create, an attempt to build out and defend it, or to, be aggressive on it. So I think people are supposed to be looking more and more to space as, what's the future there? How does that, how do we conquer space, or, take advantage of it and use it? And there's going to be big opportunities there. And, it frames this geopolitical discussion much differently, right? It's not just, what we're used to, but there's, the space out there that has been, I think, somewhat taken for granted. Obviously, the companies involved that have been doing very well, but it doesn't seem like it's a part of everyone's daily or weekly dialogue, and maybe it should be becoming more of that.
Probably
guys,
so.
am I back?
Matter, you were talking, so why don't you jump back in?
I just got nuked. I want to make sure I'm back in here. But when you look at the interim national security strategy that this administration put out, it speaks to, we've got to make sure we invest in cyber, both offensive, defensive, technology advancements, and terrorism. And those are kind of three big things. But there's precious little talk about what Peter was just mentioning. Our use of and the necessary competition, and what is the cooperation going to look like in space. And then there's also precious little discussion about nukes, other than in response to what we hear from the Chinese, going from about 290 nukes, declaring that by 2030, they're probably going to have 1,000. Years, they're probably going to have 700. And which is typical of the Chinese. They will tell you, they will hide in plain sight. They will tell you exactly what their intentions are. Then they will go about the business of meeting those expectations that they establish, and they tell the world all about it. We should be very, very conscious of what our presence looks like in space across the board, and not just in terms of these individual, I would call, initiatives that are wonderful, but how does that affect all of government in terms of how we want to posture ourselves?
Yeah, I mean, cyber is something that touches everybody every day. So they've got their arms around it. They're anxious about it. They're worried about what happens with their children. They're worried about influence in elections. What goes on in space beyond satellites that move digits quickly around the world for people to use to, different distribution systems on the planet, they are not as concerned. They also don't know how vulnerable a lot of that stuff is, how old it is, and how, in order to change it, you need to get up there with, this is why you have commercial space. You have Blue Origin, SpaceX, Sierra Nevada. They're all out there to be able to service platforms. So they all start with the space station because that's easy. But, rendezvous with a satellite, to be able to then capture it, change technology on it. These are going to be things that have to occur for viability in the future as the pace of technology changes, to be able to upgrade things rather than launch. I mean, there's so much stuff up there that you can't just keep putting things there. I mean, we talk about airspace management and combat. We talk about the airspace management with flight, but we have to manage space. And the United States has been the manager of the space catalog for the United Nations for many, many years, which is advantageous to us. I mean, we publish it, we see it, we know it, but there's a lot of stuff that deteriorates. There's a lot of junk up there. You almost have to go, all right, how do it's sort of like, cleaning your blood. You got to go through, we got to go up there and fly around and pick up the stuff that can have an impact on the architecture that's there, that supports international economic viability, as well as everything else we've become used to. It is a threat and something to think about, just even beyond hypersonic flight and the things that we are looking at from a military point of view.
And to Frank's exact point, people, we begin to give a shit about space when they start to go to ATMs and they can't get money. I mean, that's the only way it works. There's a handful of young airmen that are responsible for the good maintenance of those satellites. And if we can't go to an ATM and get our money out, the world will start to really care.
Yeah, I actually want to jump in here while we're on the topic of space, because with the recent missile test or anti-satellite missile test by Russia, there is a new element of space debris out there. I actually reached out to one of our other advisory board members, Captain Wendy Lawrence, a NASA astronaut, and asked her if she had any experience with impact of space debris while she was on the International Space Station. And she shared some images with me of an impact that was suspected to be a fleck of paint on the International Space Station. The damage was pretty remarkable considering the size of debris. So I think much like nuclear proliferation, as we see competition in space, the stakes are really high, and it's going to require an extreme amount of cooperation, because if a fleck of paint or a tiny bit of cosmic dust can cause that much damage, imagine if nations are blowing up satellites and not communicating with other things in space that are keeping our financial institutions running, our military communications up. The stakes are really, really high, and her insights were quite remarkable. At this time, definitely want to take some questions from the audience in the last few minutes that we have. Along the topic of hypersonic missiles, and General Kern, you kind of touched on this. How developed are the United States capabilities around this technology, and should we not be focusing on this based off of how competitive we are in this landscape?
So one, we have the technological capability to do these things. I mean, our nuclear program has the right guidance, navigation, computing, has rad hardened chips, has all the things that you need to do this. The question is getting the glide vehicle built and being able to then put things inside of it that survive exiting the atmosphere, coming back in, radiation, different things that enter, and it's very costly. It's not that we are not capable, it's just we have chosen not to move fast enough. The Army, and I don't quite understand sometimes how the Army was the lead for the glide vehicle for our hypersonic things. I mean, when you would think that would be with a different service, in my opinion, but that you had the Navy has got part of it. Part of the way we do business is we spread that out between different companies and different kind of service oversight, and then you try to bring it together with a prime contractor as an integrator. Whereas our competitors are doing this with state unified kind of effort with teams that are working holistically to get things done. We also compete everything through the way we do business. So the way we develop things for military use is an inhibitor to moving quickly. And you see that in every kind of thing, but in particular, this is where it is. We have the knowledge, we have the technology, we have the experience. We could do this if it becomes a national priority and do it very, very quickly, I believe.
And General Marks, before we get another question from the audience, definitely wanted to cover lessons learned from North Korea. How you manage a country that is intent on developing their nuclear program despite international pressure. What can we learn from how we manage that dynamic and that relationship in the current state of geopolitical competition?
Yeah, the challenge with North Korea is that really is a nation where we have not been able to affect or alter behavior. I mean, it is the definition of a recidivist nation. They continue to conduct military advancement at the cost of any type of civil advancement or concern for the citizens and the people of North Korea. It is an incredibly brutal regime, yet it defies every definition in terms of how you exercise influence. The United States, with its partners, certainly Japan, South Korea, the United States, China certainly has a vested interest, as does Russia. But it's now become, North Korea, as we know, North Korea is a global threat. They've been able to produce nuclear weapons. We estimate they have between 30 and 40. They have not been able to weaponize those those nuclear warheads. They have been able to produce sufficiently enriched uranium to produce about 6 warheads a year. At least those are the estimates that we have. But it's so incredibly difficult to penetrate the regime, really put experts on the ground in different types of capacities to see what their munitions development looks like, what their ballistics look like, what their chip manufacturing looks like, where are they getting this, irrespective of our efforts to try to apply sanctions as well. So I don't see any immediate change in terms of the global relationship, and that's the way I would call it, the global relationship with North Korea going forward. It simply is a matter of intense intelligence collection as best we can, watching, and then trying to determine where some particular weaknesses might be that we can exploit. Clearly, we tried to make nice with the Trump administration, and that went sideways pretty quickly. And we've been incredibly hard with the North Koreans for decades. That has not generated results. We are where we are.
Along those same lines, a question from the audience. Do you view that there's a risk for an arms race in Asia to counter these regional threats, i.e. China and North Korea?
Well, it's happening right now. I'll be very brief and then turn it over to Frank. I mean, it's an arms race that's ongoing right now. We've seen the Chinese further develop the islands that have been contested. They now have taken ownership of some of those islands. China and the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia are competing very strongly in Indonesia. Indonesia is a nation that has reached out, would love very much to have a stronger relationship with the United States. We haven't been able to figure that out. Indonesia is an aircraft carrier that would allow us, the United States, and like-minded partners to have a presence to exercise influence, not just militarily, but economically, and have a very fulsome relationship in that part of the world. And we've not been able to get out of our own way because of Indonesia's corrupt past, but they're moving beyond that. And again, let's be frank, you've got the largest democratic nation in the world is India. The second is the United States, and the third is Indonesia. Democratic nations. And we haven't been able to figure out how to have a very strong and really deep relationship with Indonesia. So the arms race is in place. The Quad exists. India, Australia, Japan, and the United States. That could be the Quad plus. We could add other nations to that, not just to be a bulwark against Chinese adventurism, but could also be the expansion of democratic ideals. It sounds like a diplomat speaking, but I do think that's what we're trying to achieve. And I would also think that the United States would want to try to establish a military presence of some sort in India. We haven't been able to figure that out yet.
I mean, we've run out of the island nations that have supported us in the past. The Philippines, Guam is inside of the arc of penetration by Chinese missiles. Chinese missiles are so good that even bringing aircraft carriers in. I mean, so the idea behind their missile technology and then putting them out on islands in the South China Sea and creating islands, as launch platforms is to increase range to push the carriers far enough away that they can't reach without aerial refueling. And if you see aerial refueling, it's extraordinarily vulnerable. And it also defeats any stealth technology. So, I mean, if you got to refuel a stealth platform, you can't do that in a stealth mode. And so all those things become very, very visible. So think of the Chinese as moving towards the reunification of Taiwan by pushing the United States to the point where the cost in aircraft carriers and national prestige is something that we won't want to engage. Okay, so I mean, and it goes right back to Sun Tzu when you talk about them. The warriors who need to fight have already lost the fight. Bottom line is push everything else till you don't have to fight. You win by superior dominance in the space to prevent your adversary from gaining the advantage. And so that's where they're going. And so that the arms race may not be missile for missile, okay, but it is to push the United States further out and to create tension with potential United States allies so that we can't develop the relationships we need. And I think the Philippines is a classic example of that.
Yeah, that's the definition of asymmetry, which is going to work to everybody's advantage.
Well, we're nearing the end of our conversation, and there are a few questions that will not be answered live on today's call. So we'll be sure to reach out to those who have unanswered questions individually. Want to give the final word to Peter. Obviously, this conversation has had a lot of military heavy conversations, what we like to say at Academy here, business follows the flag. What do you think the audience should, what are the key takeaways for our audience today, given the nature of this conversation and how it applies to their operations and businesses and their activities in the markets?
Yeah, so I think one thing is really looking at uranium, nuclear power again, and taking a closer look. How do we take advantage of that, either as an investor or when you're thinking as a company, where do you want your plants to be built? And I think nuclear is going to be an important part of that. I think it sounds like, you know, and going back, we didn't talk about it at the time, but France really started their nuclear program after the first oil crisis in 1974. So it's almost fitting, and, you know, history repeats itself, that we could see another expansion of nuclear power plants. So I think that's something people are supposed to take a look at. And I think maybe we're supposed to be a little bit more broad thinking when we talk about how are we going to replace fossil fuels. And if you're worried about, you know, your power supply, maybe it's countries that are adopting nuclear going to be part of your expansion plan. So I think that's a big part of it. And then probably the part that surprised me more, but kind of just keeps hammering home, is we're supposed to be thinking about space more. How is space going to play a part of our lives? And, you know, what technology should we be building out? Which technology should we be investing in? What should we be looking at doing that? So I think really sitting back and spending time, like, where is space headed, is a question I don't think many of us think about enough. And I think that's going to be an important part. You're seeing companies, you know, we just yesterday, a company with satellite launching was taken over by a SPAC effectively. So it's a space that people are thinking about and out there. And I think we should all you know, are thinking in terms of it, because that's probably where there's huge opportunity in the coming decades.
Thanks,
And
Peter.
the final thing I'll say is Taiwan does scare me the more we talk about this stuff, and the more, you know, as we get pushed away from being able to, you know, engage with China, that just leaves Taiwan very vulnerable. And it ties into one other thing we've been talking about a lot with Taiwan is we are well aware of the military flyovers and things, but China is using economic pressure, political pressure. They're using pressure all across, so that again, if and when they decide to do something to Taiwan, the battle will already probably be over.
Yes, a very important point, and certainly an element of all this posturing we're seeing around the globe. Just to highlight a piece of content from our team, we did do a space webinar and podcast around this time last year. Please reach out to your Academy representative if you're interested in that piece, and we can send it your way. As always, we're so appreciative that you've taken the time to spend with us today. If you do have any follow-on questions, or if, as you're reading the news, ever have any questions that our advisory board can help support, please reach out to us at info@academysecurities.com or to your point of contact from our team. Have a wonderful afternoon and a great holiday season.
Thanks, everybody.